the two contexts I'm going to be focusing on are servers in the cloud and the client side. But today, the client side more or less often means the web browser. So we'll be talking about the web browser. So separate parts of this talk. So I'm not the kind of person who puts up newspaper headlines at the beginning of a security talk. So I'll spare you that. But hopefully, we can just skip to saying that privacy breaches have become fairly routine. Like, it's not that much of a shock when you do see a headline about one. Right? How many of you just heard about the very recent revelation of the LinkedIn password breach that was 117 million username and password pairs that were obtained by a server compromise that are now surfacing out in the wild that people are reusing because people use the same username and password on many websites. Mark Zuckerberg was owned in this particular way. His accounts on 2 other social media websites were compromised because he was using the same very poor password. You've probably heard about the US Office of Personnel Management breach, right? 20 million personnel files compromised and leaked from servers. And of course, somewhat ironically, even the software that is meant to protect our sensitive information, perhaps not on the server, but at least in the middle of the network, OpenSSL, the OpenSSL library, had this horrible vulnerability in it, which could have been used to leak sensitive information from servers that chose to use OpenSSL because they had sensitive information on them, right? So this is a pretty bad state of affairs. If we wanted to start off talking about this topic, I feel like I sort of owe you, if I claim to be doing work in this area, I owe you some sort of sketch of why does this just keep happening again and again and again? And so I'd offer 3 high-level observations about why this may be happening again and again. First is that I believe, after working on it for 8 years, that trying to build software that robustly preserves confidentiality it's pretty subtle. And I mean that in 2 very different ways. First, it's pretty subtle to design, like even the paper architecture of what the modules should be and what their interfaces should be is pretty hard to get right. And then even if that was right, and it usually isn't, implementing it, the programming, things can go wrong in the way that you unfaithfully program the design that you started with. Second, often, and we'll spend some time talking about this today, the system software, like the OS or the browser, doesn't really give developers the primitives they need to make it easy for them to build applications that protect sensitive data robustly. And so when it's hard, people don't try, or they try and fail. And finally, and this is, I'm not sure I have an answer to this one completely myself, if you try to build hardened software that's more robust against attack in one way or another, often there's some sort of performance cost. And very few people, it appears, commercially want to trade performance for privacy. If you tell people your server is going to run 25% slower, or well, 25% maybe doesn't sound that bad to some people, or even like 50% slower, but it's going to be really secure, people say, I don't want to buy double the number of servers. That blows my profit margin or reduces my profit margin. So given this landscape, what we're going to talk about today is how do you design applications that preserve privacy when they're attacked? And that's going to be about sort of principles and practice, separate from what the OS primitives are, just in general. Then what the right primitives from the system software might be to try to make it easier to do that first thing. And finally, how to provide privacy at acceptable performance cost, or at least as close to acceptable as possible. Okay. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what I call exploit-tolerant servers. Servers that, even if exploited, don't give up sensitive data to an attacker. So we have a diverse audience here. Just to make sure we start on the same page, I'll go very quickly through this. You all know what a software vulnerability is, right? So it's a bug that lets some input cause a program to behave in a way that the programmer never intended. We say that an attacker exploits a vulnerability, right, to usually execute operations without authorization that he should have had. And of course, lots of servers hold sensitive data. We went through some examples earlier. And so if an attacker can exploit a vulnerability on a network-connected server, they can leak sensitive information like another user's credit card or medical records. Or interestingly, and this is going to be a focus of this talk today, for the first part of this talk, the web server has key material on it that's intended to be used to protect the sensitive information in transit across the network. And that itself is sensitive information on the server that's very attractive for attack and leaking by the attacker. So in some sense, by trying to secure the communication in the network, we add more sensitive information to the server that's a target for attack, which is interesting, I believe. And finally, you could just destroy data and so forth, integrity attacks. So, and of course, as you probably well know, lots of vulnerabilities will let an attacker just inject binary code of their choice into a server, a running server. It will run with the privileges of the server. So some of you are sitting there thinking, yeah, but surely this is just because people shouldn't be programming in C, or maybe vulnerabilities will just eventually be eradicated. Surely we have our best people working on eradicating vulnerabilities. And so if you look at, from CVE reports, the number of severe vulnerabilities reported year on year, well, the overall trend is not very encouraging. We have 2014 all the way on the right here. So maybe you could say, oh, we're sort of getting better, but I don't want to zoom in that level of detail. What I will also add to this is that in 2016, where we are today, a couple of years ago, there was a paper on an attack called BROP, Blind Return-Oriented Programming. How many of you have heard of BROP? Okay, so BROP was work done by my graduated PhD student, Andrea Bittau. BROP takes down what many people think is our best defense against exploits on Linux. Basically, 64-bit ASLR. You're randomizing addresses so attackers shouldn't be able to jump to their code that they want to jump to anymore. BROP makes it feasible to get a root shell on a Linux server using 64-bit ASLR. We knew years ago that 32-bit wasn't enough entropy. Turns out 64-bit doesn't work very well either. So that's where we are today. Okay. Now, when you look at this trend, you might say, oh, so like we're just making worse and worse software. That's not necessarily true. One thing is you can think of it as cancer. Like maybe we're getting better at diagnosing the problem. So we're looking at software more than ever, and maybe that's a big part of why we're finding more.
What is the number counting exactly?
They're written at the top of the bars here. So 7321.
What of what?
Vulnerabilities, severe vulnerabilities in servers that were reported.
So like events that are recorded?
No, it is an instance of a problem in a piece of software that could be exploited, that would be severe if exploited. Thank you. And so we're looking more and more closely, but we're finding more. So hopefully I've convinced you that we're not getting rid of vulnerabilities anytime soon, probably. And so what we're going to focus on is, can we build software that doesn't disclose sensitive data even when it's exploited successfully, since it looks like exploits are here to stay. And as I foreshadowed already, servers that are intended to keep sensitive data private use crypto protocols like SSL or TLS. And those crypto protocols introduce extra sensitive data on the server, key material. So if you're running like an SSL TLS enabled web server, it has to keep its RSA private key or DSS private key, whatever cipher suite you're using. I use RSA in this talk, secret. Because if the attacker gets their hand on the server's private key, they're going to be able to impersonate the server to legitimate users, right? We all know this. Okay. So how can an attacker, just like let's look at a simple example. If you exploited a web server, how would you be able to obtain the server's private key? What would this look like? So we're going to start with a straw man. I know what some of you are thinking, that this is worse than the current state of servers, but I have to start simple. We'll get more complicated in just a moment. So the simplest possible TLS-enabled web server would look like this. It's one process with all of the code in it and all of the data in it in one address space. I'm going to use ovals as code in this talk and arrows to denote privileges, permissions. So this arrow means you can read from the internet. This blob of code can read from the internet. The process has permissions to read from, say, the file in the file system that has the RSA private key in it, right? So let's say there's a vulnerability in HTTP parse. Pretty good candidate if you monitor bug track and vulnerability reports, does string manipulation, right? Nobody knows how to write parsers, strings. And so we're a single process, and we're going to be naive and run it as root because, maybe this software somewhere needs to do certain operations that require root privilege. So of course, what can happen is if there's a vulnerability in HTTP parse, an attacker can exploit the vulnerability, inject his own code into this single monolithic process, and then just use the privileges of the process to read the private key and leak it to himself over the internet. Right? This is very straightforward. This is just a standard, stack smashing vulnerability or so forth and injecting code. So you might be asking yourself, well, that's a bad design, or telling yourself that's a bad design. Did the HTTP parser need to be able to read the HTTP, the RSA private key for TLS? No, that's not HTTP parsing. So why did we give it access to that? So this brings us to a very old idea from the 70s with Jerry Seltzer paper, right? The principle of least privilege, I'm sure you've all heard of this, not even in a security context originally. You want to limit the damage that any one bug or malicious exploit, it's just a bug, exploit of a bug, can do. And so what you do is you take your code, right, this is the old story, you partition it into compartments, which are isolated from each other. You give each compartment the minimal privilege necessary to do its job and no more. You'd better define very narrow minimal interfaces between the compartments, because if you don't, what does it mean to compartmentalize? You haven't compartmentalized unless the interfaces are very narrow and specific, right? And then what you should do is design your system assuming that exploit will occur, especially in the pieces of code that directly read toxic input from users. Users are where the bad things come from, typically. And when I say least privilege, what do I mean by privilege? Well, it's just permissions, access rights to memory, the file system. On a modern operating system, you could actually limit which system calls using something like systrace or SE/Linux, right? So which system calls a piece of code can call. And privilege is defined with respect to a piece of code. All right, so with the principle of least privilege in mind, let's try to get a little closer to what legacy web servers look like. Now maybe you'll have a master process, which calls fork, and produces a child worker process where only the worker talks to the network. Right? The master doesn't talk to the network at all, so no exploits coming in here. Right? And then maybe the master has the privilege to read the RSA private key as root, but maybe the worker doesn't have that privilege. This seems smarter, right? So now, if you exploit HTTP parse, this low privilege may be running as nobody process can't read that file. And so great, the worker can't read the key. And you can do finer grained isolation. The master, when it creates this child, the child can limit which system calls it can invoke, and we can really try to lock the privileges down. So great, so this talk is over. Right? The status quo already protects the private key. Right? Are we done? Well, to understand if we're done, let's zoom in and look at the worker process a little bit more. Of course, the worker process needs the RSA private key in order to be able to do TLS, to complete the TLS handshake. So it's going to need the private key, even if it doesn't have access to the file, it's going to need a copy of the private key in memory, right? And so if we put the worker process in one monolithic address space, again, all memory, rectangles in this talk are memory, all of the code can access all of the data inside this process. So now, of course, if there's a vulnerability in HTTP parse, you can still leak the private key just from memory rather than the file system, right? Okay, so where are we going here? Well, what we'd like to do is somehow make sure that this unit of code can't read this pretty small piece of memory. So a potential remedy is if we had support in our primitives, in our system software for limiting the access of code to memory at a very fine granularity, maybe that would help. And so does Unix, does Linux let us do that? Well, it turns out that Unix processes are pretty ill-suited to least privilege. And that's because you can think of them as kind parents, generous parents who want their children to have every advantage. Right? They give access to what they have by default. So Unix fork is default grant, right? If you create a child process, if the parent had any files open already, or whatever is in its memory, the child gets a copy of the address space, right? A copy on write, copy of the address space, and access to any files that the parent had open, right? And so what this means is that if you want to program in a least privilege way and create a separate process with lower privilege, you need to understand every sensitive piece of data and file descriptor that you have open and conscientiously scrub it before you do anything dangerous in the child. Why you would know where all the sensitive data is in your memory as a programmer is a mystery to me. In fact, there were specific vulnerabilities, like in OpenSSH, where there was a library that took something that turned out to be key material and made a copy in scratch storage. It's in libc. And then that just sits there in memory, and the programmer hasn't read libc. And meanwhile, you've got a copy of this sensitive data sitting in your address space. Right? The reason we have libraries is because you don't want to have to read every line of code in the library to use it. So you might not even know where all the data is in your sensitive memory. Okay, so generous parenting doesn't work. Let's try tough love, right? So default deny compartment. So now when you create a child, maybe just as a straw man idea, let's say you get nothing by default. Some of you are like, yeah, that sucked. That was my life. No, so you don't get access to the open files the parent had. You don't get access to the contents of memory of the parent. You just get maybe a copy of your own code and nothing else. Well, that's great. That really closely adheres to least privilege. Unfortunately, it doesn't sound particularly useful. Right now, you can't do anything. So we need to find some way, if we're going to do default deny, to at least grant things. Let the parent explicitly grant the few things, the minimal set of what the child needs. Okay, so now let's take this another step and say, let's do it for legacy code. So you're going to take Apache with OpenSSL and try to do this for Apache. All right, so cool, like graduate students, go. You've got a worker process in Apache with OpenSSL. How many memory items are you going to need to explicitly grant the low privilege worker access to in order to do its job, just starting with Apache the way it was written? Well, poor graduate students. The worker in Apache uses over 600 separately allocated memory objects, and they're all over the heap and globals. Why? Because programmers don't think that way typically, at least not in legacy code. They just are used to having one address space. They allocate wherever they want and use wherever they want, right? People write software today with sort of assuming a monolithic address space structure. So in the first part of this talk, the contribution I'm going to describe is a system called Wedge. And what it is it's a set of default deny primitives for constructing these compartments for isolating pieces of a program, and for explicitly enumerating a compartment's privileges so that you can do default deny but still let privilegeless compartments do things, where you enumerate only the things they're allowed to do. In Wedge, what we do is we use hardware page protection to enforce fine-grained memory privileges, even with respect to a single variable. And I'll explain how that works. And finally, and this was a direction we hadn't expected to go in initially, we provided tools for the developer to try to make it less painful to take legacy code and figure out which privileges and which pieces of memory you need to grant to low privilege workers, for example. Okay. So the end result with Wedge, hopefully we'll see, is applications that protect sensitive data even when they're exploited. Okay, so let's talk about the Wedge system. Our default deny compartment is called an S-thread, and it just has a different name, but it's basically what we told you about on the strawman default deny slide. So you create what we call an S-thread. The parent creates the child gets access to nothing, default deny. It's like a thread. You can easily share pointers and file descriptors inside of an S-thread, but the child that you create from a parent doesn't get anything by default. The programmer has to explicitly grant all privileges that the child is given. Now, how would we do this for memory? You know about maybe things like file descriptor passing. Those already exist. But what about for, say, pages in a process? Okay, so to talk about that, I need to give you a little bit of background on heap memory allocation, most of which you probably already know. So let's say we have this blob of code for the HTTP parser, and we want to put it in its own tiny compartment with nothing else. We want to be able to grant the memory that this parser needs, but nothing else. Which means, for example, that certainly sensitive data in the parent, we don't want HTTP parser to have access to. Right? We only want to grant it the things that are non-sensitive. Okay? Because we're worried, just to keep it straight, that this will be exploited later. Right? Okay, so let's say we have some C code for the parent, and the parent's address space is divided into pages. And just like most C programs, servers, maybe we do some memory allocation. And maybe there's something sensitive, which I've shown in blue here, which is that we'll call malloc for some key material. Okay. And then maybe we'll also malloc something else, which is not sensitive, which I've shown in orange here. Okay, some buffer. And yeah, and so on. So what happens in memory when you do heap memory allocation? Well, malloc just sort of does what it does. So it finds storage in some page, you don't know where, of the size that you asked for. This first blue malloc will say happen here in this page. And by default, when you fork in a default grant world, the child will get access. And when you allocate the orange stuff, you don't know where malloc's going to put it. It'll put it somewhere, and the child will get access in the default grant world when you fork. Okay, but remember, we wanted to implement privilege with page mappings at fine granularity. The key thing to note here is that naive malloc might mix sensitive and non-sensitive data in the same page, but we want to use page protection to do isolation. So we need some way to pull these apart. And the way we do this is using something called tagged memory, which basically is just some sugar that lets us segregate non-sensitive data by page. So now what we do is we introduce a new primitive called a tag. And you can think of a tag as an arena, like an arena allocator, basically. And so what we'll do then is old malloc still exists for legacy stuff. And in fact, if you're allocating something sensitive that you don't want to give anyone else access to, you just use standard old malloc. That's what happens by default with standard malloc. Nobody else can access. And then if you know you want to share something, you call our smalloc, our sharing malloc. And you specify a tag for the arena to allocate from. Okay? And so what happens in this case is when you call sthread create to create this low privilege process in Wedge, what will happen when you run the parent before calling sthread create is that when you call tag new, an arena will be allocated contiguously at page boundaries, right? The standard old malloc stuff will be allocated not in that arena, just wherever standard malloc would go. And the orange stuff will be allocated because you specify the tag, the purple tag, in that arena. Right? And so then the stuff that you want to share will get allocated there. Then when you call sthread create, what you do is you tell sthread create, I'm going to give this new child sthread access to this tag. And then those pages the new sthread are granted access to. Okay, so what this means is that just as a bit of sugar for the programmer, if you use tags when you allocate memory you want to share, you don't have to, in your sthread create, list 600 different things. Right? You just add tags to your mallocs and you can allocate, just specify a couple of tags when you create a child sthread. So you segregate by sensitivity class, roughly speaking. So great. What the Wedge OS primitives enforce is that when you grant tags, you can only grant a subset of the privileges that you hold, nothing that you don't hold as a parent. And I already said this, tags abbreviate specifying which memory privileges a thread should get. So the second primitive that we need is what we call callgates. And this is a mechanism that lets unprivileged code make calls that use sensitive data. We're not going to let unprivileged code read, say, the RSA key, but it might need to invoke operations in other compartments that use the RSA key, say, to complete the TLS handshake. Okay, so a callgate is going to be almost like a system call, but within our application. It's going to be an entry point with predefined privileges and a specific entry point. So when you create a callgate, you can invoke it at a later time. The creator of the callgate can grant the callgate a subset of the creator's privileges. And then when you invoke the callgate runs with the privileges that were granted at creation time for that callgate. So that means that a low privilege sthread can call a callgate that runs at higher privilege, just like a system call, at a dedicated entry point, but in user space. Right. So here's an example for our Apache web server, which is going to be our running example. You've got some code that handles the client connection, and you've got the reading from the internet and this RSA private key. We didn't want to let the code that could be exploited from the internet to be able to read the RSA private key. So what we'll do instead is it might need to use the session key to do bulk encryption of data during the connection. This is what pops out of the TLS handshake at the end. And then what we do is we create a Callgate which will set up the session key using the RSA private key. So the shading means privileged with respect to some data, and the lack of shading means unprivileged. Okay. So the architecture becomes this. The handle client code runs at low privilege. It invokes this Callgate, which does have the privilege to read the RSA private key. This will then spit out the session key, and only that can be read by handle client. And so now this blob of code, handle client, if it's exploited, can't leak the RSA private key. And that's it. Those are the three main primitives in the Wedge set of primitives: Sthreads, Callgates, and tagged memory. Now, I want to talk briefly about how do we figure out which privileges to grant. I sort of sidestepped that later. I said we give you sugar for briefly specifying it, but you still needed to use smalloc at all of those allocations, presumably, right? So let me just tell you how bad this was. This actually was generated with GraphViz from real data, by the way. It's not, if we tried to label everything in here, you couldn't read it. This is zoomed way out. So Apache's client handler blob of code needs access to 222 heap objects and 389 globals. And those are spread out across 72 source files just for the heap allocations for where the mallocs happen. This is your life. If you wanted to partition that, you would need to find all of the mallocs for the pieces of data that you wanted to pass to a lower privilege S-thread and change them to smalloc. So that sounds like it's not going to happen. So if you did want to do this, what questions would you want to answer to partition legacy code like Apache? Which code is executed when a function is called? Like, where does it go and execute other functions? Which objects do the pointers executed in that code path point to? So I know which memory gets used. And then where were those objects first allocated so I can find the mallocs for them and change them to smalloc? This is sort of what a developer who wants to chop up code into compartments using Wedge would like to know. So we built a tool that we affectionately call Crowbar for prying apart a monolithic application into separate compartments.
One size, right?
Yes, so once we can, of the object, once we know where the allocation is, the malloc line has the size there. Right, so yes, I agree. Our Crowbar tool uses dynamic analysis. So the intuition we started from is that if you execute a non-exploit request on the server, that tends to exercise, it's not perfect, but tends to exercise non-attack memory accesses, legitimate memory accesses. For example, it's not executing code on the stack typically. The general approach we take from that intuition is we'll trace all the memory accesses made, every single memory access, as the server process handles benign requests. And then what we'll do also is every malloc that happens in the application will log also, right? And then what we can do is just crunch the log afterwards offline and sort of answer all the questions that I described in the previous slide. Right, malloc, if you instrument the malloc, you know what the return pointer was when you act, and you know what the size was. So then you can see for every memory reference later which malloc it was referring to, right? You can do this offline. So the caveats for this are, of course, it's dynamic analysis, so you have a coverage problem like you always do with dynamic analysis. This only finds permissions used by code paths that benign requests that you happen to see exercised. It only uses the memory that those network requests happened to access when they were processed. And also, just because there was some struct that got accessed doesn't mean that you should grant the HTTP parser access to that whole struct. Like maybe that struct has some fields that are sensitive and some that aren't. Maybe the access was to a field that wasn't sensitive, but there are other fields in the same struct that are sensitive. So this doesn't mean you don't have to have a brain. You can use our tool to figure out where the mallocs are and see what's in the object and make it an indecision, is that sensitive or not, and split the struct if you need to some of the time. Okay. So we applied Wedge to the Apache and OpenSSL secure web server. Let's talk about what that looked like a little bit. And I should say, well, no, I'll say that later. So remember, our original goal was to protect sensitive data stored on the server that was possibly in memory, possibly in the file system. And we got to this design. So, are we done yet? And so what I described so far was a very simple attacker who would just inject an exploit here and hope to read directly from memory this key. What I'm going to talk to you about next are some more subtle attacks, where an attacker is both more intelligent and possibly has more capabilities in what they can do than in that simple attack. So there are two more attacks that we need to consider. I only have time to talk about one to give you a flavor of things. The one I'm going to talk about is if you have a passive eavesdropper who also can exploit the server. So what I mean by this is there's some user accessing the server over TLS. The attacker records the whole connection, doesn't know anything about what the encrypted data is, and then exploits the server later, hoping to be able to decrypt the previously eavesdropped session. Okay? And there's another attack. A stronger attacker could actually mount an active man-in-the-middle attack while having a server exploit. So he interposes himself between the live user and the server. We shut that down too. That's more complicated than I have time to talk about today. So you can look at the paper for that. But let's talk about the passive eavesdropper and server exploit. So I need to give you a little background in the SSL TLS handshake for this to make sense. How many of you have looked at the steps in the SSL TLS handshake before, just out of curiosity? Fair number of you, okay. So the thing you most need to know, I've not written it all out, is if you've got a client and server making a TLS handshake, there's these three pieces of information that should change every time you start a new TLS connection. One's the client random generated freshly by the client, server random generated freshly by the server, and something called the encrypted premaster secret. This is for an RSA cipher suite, where the client generates a random bit string and then encrypts it in the public key of the server and sends that over the network. Okay, so this is TLS for our talk today. And so now let's look at what happens in the design I talked to you about so far. So we had set up session key, which produces the session key. Handle client is going to be doing this handshake, talking to the network. And so what eventually will happen is set up session key is a Callgate, high privilege, which takes as arguments from the low privilege, we assume exploitable, process of these three things, which are needed to generate the session key. Okay. And these are all known to the network speaking S-thread. And then set up session key sets up the session key, which handle client can then use. So now let's think about this. What if the attacker, which we assume they can do for light-colored ovals, compromises this oval? Well, he's won. Why? Because he eavesdropped these. He doesn't need to decrypt this. He can just supply these arguments to this bit of privileged code, and out will pop the session key for the previous eavesdropped session, because these are not fresh. They're from the previous session. They all go by in the clear and are free to eavesdrop. To be eavesdropped. Right? And so what this means is you don't just need to prevent this bit of code from reading this bit of memory. If it can invoke operations that still do things with that memory, that might be about as bad. Right? And so we gave this name. We call this an oracle attack, where instead of getting the private key, you get an oracle for the private key. You can sort of do things with the private key, though you can't read the bits of it. And just one little tidbit. HiStar's SSL web server contains oracles for the RSA private key. So this is not specific to Wedge. Even a diffC system can have this problem if you don't think about how to split your design correctly. We showed that in a follow-up piece of work. So it doesn't matter if you're using discretionary access control or information flow control. You need to understand this kind of thing and really think about the crypto protocol if you want to robustly protect against these sorts of attacks. Okay. What do we want? What might the answer be? Don't let the attacker supply all of these. Maybe change the interface to this so that the attacker can't supply the server random. Why? Why should this blob of code be supplying the server random anyway? It's just a random number. It could be from a privileged compartment elsewhere in the server that can't talk to the network. The whole point is that the server was supposed to generate the server random. That's why it's in the freaking protocol. Right? Otherwise, why did we have this at all? Okay? So this is interesting. Small changes to the interface to privileged code can give you very improved security properties. So what does the improved design look like? Well, it basically looks like this. You have a server random, which is produced by setup session key itself, not provided as an argument by the low privilege code. And then the server random is readable by handle clients that it can send it over the network before it gets exploited, right? And then everything else works as before. And this closes down that Oracle attack. You can't generate, the attacker who compromises this can't generate a session key for a past eavesdropped session. He can only generate a fresh session key for his own new session. Okay, so we built this thing. It wasn't a huge amount of code. It was about 1,500 line kernel module and 1,100 lines of userland code, a lot of which were for tagged malloc stuff. We built Crowbar as well, and we used as case studies Apache with the OpenSSL library and OpenSSH using the pre-privileged separation design for OpenSSH. Just to sort of look at how much we're trying to make things hard for ourselves. How much work would it have been to do our better privilege separation, if you want to call it that, versus what Niels Provost had done before us. So one question is, how would I measure if I made things better in terms of security? Right? So I do all this work, I partition, I know how to measure performance, that's easy to measure. But what about, have I made things less likely to be leaked? One way, it's not perfect, that the community thinks about this is this term vulnerability surface. Right? So what are the number of lines of code in the program running on the server that execute with high privilege to be able to access sensitive data? If that number goes down, and you assume that bugs are sort of spread throughout code all over the place, and less code can access sensitive data, then maybe we've improved things. So what this shows you is that the total line count for Apache plus OpenSSL was 250,000 lines of code. After we did our work, the amount of code that executed in Callgates was only about 16,000 lines of code, which was 6% of the total volume of Apache. So basically a bug anywhere in any of this could have let you leak key material in the original Apache. And we cut that by 94%. Does this prove that there weren't bugs in our Callgates? Absolutely not. It just means that there's hope maybe to audit this much code, potentially. And we didn't have to change.
Argue that someone making things easier for the attacker, right?
Telling them where to focus.
I know where to focus on. Right?
On the other hand, I know where to focus. Right? So I have some hope of auditing. Would you like to be sure that there are no bugs in this or no bugs in this? So maybe this is symmetric, but
Rob attacks, they need attacks elsewhere.
Yeah, sure, yeah. So the attacker would know to focus.
What to focus on right now.
Yeah, so that may be. Nevertheless, I believe that knowing where the developers who want to defend should focus, I think, is a huge step forward. Also, we didn't have to change a whole hell of a lot of code in this huge system in order to achieve this result. But if this were 94%, then you'd be really worried, right? So we thought that looked promising. On the performance side, we think Wedge incurs acceptable performance overhead. There's definitely an overhead. The metric we looked at for performance was throughput, requests per second for static content on the server. Static content's the hard workload. If it's dynamic content, that just means there's more CPU for the other work the server's doing and will look better. And so this is us trying to be hard on ourselves with static content, right? I think the High Star paper looked at dynamic content for throughput. If you don't do SSL TLS session caching, which avoids the public key crypto at the handshake, you get a 6% throughput reduction request per second for Wedge versus original Apache OpenSSL. That's because that public key crypto is expensive. So our overhead looks smaller. If you do all sessions cached, which is completely unrealistic, it's never the case that all sessions are cached, then we get a worst case 23% throughput reduction. So the truth will be somewhere between 6 and 23%, depending on how many of your TLS connections are cached. Why is there a cost? Well, you have to create Sthreads for all these different compartments that we create, these ovals. Vanilla Apache just reuses Unix worker processes again and again without forking more. And there are lots of compartments and callgates for each user session. And that means that we incur TLB flushes and context switches between these Sthreads. Right? We did make some optimizations that brought us to this performance level. I don't have time to go into detail. One of them was to use checkpoint and restore. Basically, when you create an S-thread, it hasn't been messed up by getting malicious stuff from users yet. So we take a sort of snapshot efficiently of that memory state so that when that user request is done, we can quickly restore to that memory state when we're done. And there's been some follow-on work by my graduated student Andrea Bittow with Adam Belay in OSDI 12 on using Intel CPU virtualization hardware to make the page table diddling that you have to do to make this work faster. So that was very interesting too. Now, I'm going to do a very brief, shallow dive, deliberately by design, on the client side for web applications. So we're going to reset. We're not talking about the server anymore. We're not even talking about discretionary access control anymore, as you'll see in a moment, and talk about the browser just a little bit. So I probably don't need to tell you that the web is not static pages anymore. It's code when you visit pages much of the time. It's applications. You can sort of tell how old a computer scientist is by looking at how static their web page is. Like if you look at Mark Weiser Award winners, typically like they have these like old style HTML, maybe even no CSS on their page. But you young folks are building web applications today, and so pages contain JavaScript code that the browser downloads and executes without asking you as a user, unless you're using NoScript, and then the web's not very much fun for you, I imagine. What's interesting about the web is that we've seen huge proliferation of web applications. One reason for that is that it's really easy to build them. And the reason is the web is sort of almost the apotheosis of open source. All that JavaScript code, even if it's minified or obfuscated, is there in source code form in the page because it has to be downloaded for your browser. And so it's very easy to reuse code from other people's apps, and you wind up with these pastiche web applications, right, where you cobble together JavaScript libraries and fragments of code from other sites written by the way, God knows who, and what their motives were, right? And so, of course, you should be worried about privacy in web applications. We don't need to spend much time on this. Obviously, the web apps are software like anything else, and if you're doing anything sensitive, your sensitive data, your location, your email, your bank statements are being handled by these apps. And of course, the JavaScript developer could be malicious. So should you advise programs presented to you by parties you don't trust? Should you run programs presented to you by parties you don't trust? Your browser does. So then the question is, why aren't you getting owned all the time every time you visit a website? Like, is there any saving grace in today's browser? You visit multiple sites in different tabs. So here's an example of why things aren't totally messed up today. This is an example I'll call bad weather, which just actually looks pretty good, but the bad is not about the weather. Let's say you're browsing your bank statement in one tab and a weather site written by another person from another server on the other tab, all in one binary in your browser. Right, so what's to stop the person who developed weather.com from putting malicious JavaScript inside that page that just then reads from your bank statement and sends with XML HTTP requests to weather.com, which clearly you do not want, or you weren't expecting at least. And the answer, of course, as you probably mostly all know, is the same origin policy. How many of you have heard of the same origin policy, just to sort of help me calibrate? Okay, so what the same origin policy says, right, is that if there's a script in this tab with the origin weather.com, the browser runtime is going to sort of make sure that no script from this domain name, this origin, is allowed to read any data in a tab associated with a different domain name. That's the same origin policy, right? And so that's why weather.com can't leak your bank statements. This sounds pretty good. The browser prevents the script from one domain from reading content from another. And this is a form of discretionary access control, right? You either can read it or you can't. If you can read it, it's yours after that. You do whatever you want with it. So what's interesting is that discretionary access control, I claim, for the browser is broken in two completely opposite ways at the same time. It's too permissive and lets people own you, and it's too restrictive. It actually keeps people from building apps that we want. So why is that? If we look at too permissive, third-party code can actually leak sensitive data. And the reason has to do with some subtlety of the browser architecture, which is that if you include code in your page using a script tag, which you often have to do if you use jQuery. jQuery only works if you put it in a script tag. By the way, jQuery is used by over 70% of the Alexa top 500 websites. Then that script runs with the full authority of the enclosing page. There is no separate origin. And that's because jQuery wants to be able to look at the DOM of the page to render things nicely and so forth. And so what that means is if you include a malicious library in your page in a script tag, the browser will do nothing to stop exfiltration to some other origin, actually. Okay? The second reason, second problem, which is even more interesting, is that it's too restrictive. Let's say I want to build an application like Mint. How many of you have heard of Mint? Okay, so this is in the United States and Canada. It's like Quicken, but online. So it integrates your data from all of your bank accounts and shows you graphs of how dire the situation is. Okay, so let's say you wanted to build a web version of Mint that runs in the browser. So there would be a script that you would download from mint.com, and that script would want to read bank statement data from HSBC and Chase.com. Sorry, same origin policy says it can't do that. Different origin. Why? Because the browser architects, quite rightly, thought, oh, well, I don't know who wrote the script from mint.com. It could just leak your bank data back to that origin server, Mint. Right? So this means you can't build what we call this kind of app, like a secure third-party mashup apps. And mashups are some of the most useful apps on the web. Right? So discretionary access control is too brittle. You either cede control of the data or deny access utterly. So how can we do privacy for the user and flexibility for the developer? So in fact, let's look at Mint a little bit more. Discretionary access control forces a choice between privacy and functionality. And unfortunately, when you give a user that choice, they almost always choose functionality. Oh, it's a shiny object. I want that. I'm gonna use that website. It looks great, right? So I already explained how today's browser doesn't support this third-party mashup. That's choosing lack of functionality and strong privacy. So the user doesn't get to use the app. What if we chose functionality? In fact, the web does support something called CORS, cross-origin resource sharing, which was added as a band-aid after the SOP to try to let people disable discretionary access control so that they could build things like this non-securely. So what if this bank puts a header on its content saying, oh, mint.com can read my data, which the bank would have to decide to do, which, by the way, also means that now your bank can decide which apps you can run, which I don't particularly like the idea of. Right? Then you would have, but if the bank did allow it, then you would have functionality. You could build Mint this way, but then the user gives up privacy because the browser can't do anything to protect the sensitive data after the script reads it. Okay, so how does Mint really work, given this state of affairs? Oh, it's much worse than you would imagine. Mint asks users for all of their login credentials for all of their banks and stores them on its server. And then Mint connects to all of your banks, grabs the data on its server, and produces the web page and sends you that. Right? So, by the way, Mint has over 10 million users and has now been acquired by Quicken. So there's a germ of a solution that I'll extremely briefly, say a couple words about, which is confinement. This is a very old idea from Butler Lamson in 1973, but it's been somewhat elusive in systems that people really use. That's we're going to let untrusted code, like the script from mint.com, read sensitive data, but then block the code from leaking the data to parties that are not authorized. How do we do this? One way of thinking about it is if the browser runtime allowed mint.com to do cross-origin reads, but then the browser runtime said, oh, you're not allowed to talk to any origin at all anymore after doing those reads, then you could still render the pretty graphs in the browser, but not exfiltrate the data. Okay? That's the high-level idea. Now, if you want to do this in practice in the browser and have the system ever see use, there are some really hard constraints you need to deal with. First of all, web developers won't learn a new language. If they're like some web developers I know, they barely know any language. Also, you can't touch the JavaScript runtime, because if you go talk to Google, and we've tried, there are these things called the browser wars, which mean that people publish micro benchmarks of the time to do some tiny operation and say, look, Chrome is better than Firefox because we're like this many microseconds quicker on this tiny micro benchmark. And so if you tell Google that you want to add instructions to the hop path in its highly optimized JIT compiled V8 JavaScript runtime, they'll say, no extra instructions, please. I don't care how much security you're going to get me. And you need to keep familiar concepts in place for web developers. You want to use origins as principles, which the same origin policy does, and keep the same in-page constructs like frames and tabs, iframes, and so forth. So in one slide, what is our solution to this thorny problem? It's called COWL, Confinement with Origin Web Labels, which you can read about in OSDI 2014 if you choose. Basically, all applications do is label data with the origin that deems it sensitive. So for example, for data sensitive to Chase, you label the data chase.com. Data sensitive to Chase and HSBC, you can have a conjunction. This data is derived from data from both Chase and HSBC, so you say this data is sensitive to both chase.com and hsbc.com. So this lets you do cross-origin sharing, but if the recipient of data reads data sensitive to some domain name like foo.com, it can no longer communicate with any domain name other than foo.com. So how do you do mint in COWL? It's very simple. You write mint using the very few COWL primitives. Chase.com labels its data chase.com that it returns over TLS. When the mint script gets the data, it can't read the data and it can't read the label. It just knows that it got something. The browser runtime enforces that. Same thing for HSBC with the label of hsbc.com. If the mint script wants to read either of these pieces of data, it needs to raise its label to allow the read to say chase.com. And this label is in this context of, say, this iframe where this script is running. And then you raise your label to chase.com, the browser will then let you read Chase's data. You raise your label further to the conjunction of chase.com and hsbc.com, and then you read that bit of data, and then you render your graphs. And the browser runtime makes sure that the script at this point can't talk to any origin other than the origin that is the conjunction of chase.com and hsbc.com, and ça n'existe pas. If there's no origin, it's the conjunction of two origins. So you can't talk to anyone anymore. Okay. So you get flexibility and privacy. The design of COWL emphasizes deployability. I don't have time to go into these details, unfortunately. We built 2 open source implementations for Firefox and Chromium that have been released. The one for Firefox has been released. There are only 3 new JavaScript primitives. It's fast. It doesn't slow down page loads much. The reason is we're not fine-grained the way, say, GIF is. So we don't track at an object granularity. We set labels at an iframe granularity. And so that means you only have to check labels not on every object access, but on every cross-iframe communication, which is much more seldom. And we're backward compatible. I only gave you one example. There are many other examples of applications that you can build securely with privacy and COWL. We've been written up in the press, which we found interesting. We were a little scared when the Register wanted to interview us, but they were very nice in the end. We've standardized COWL. We have a first public working draft in the W3C, the standards body for the web. So we're really trying to push this to adoption in mainstream browsers. And, well, I will conclude with a synthesis, and I'm not going to talk about opportunities. I showed you two very different designs. One that was based on discretionary access control, the Wedge system for servers, and one that was based on mandatory access control confinement for Cal. How can we think about the relative capabilities of these two things? Here's what I would say about that, having spent a lot of time with my head in both of these designs. Confinement, of course, lets untrusted code read sensitive data. The risk you have there is covert channels. Right? The untrusted code now has your sensitive data, but if it changes the time it renders something, then something in another iframe could notice that and then leak your data, even though the browser runtime doesn't allow the direct leak of the data. Discretionary access control sounds like it helps there. It denies unprivileged code access to sensitive data, but it requires you to assume that your privileged code is correct, which you might not, as one of the questioners asked about, necessarily know is true. So sort of different strengths and weaknesses of these two approaches. I personally believe that I'd rather have the covert channels risk than the risk that assuming that all of my privileged code is correct. And I think I'll conclude there. Thank you. Questions? Brian?
Very, very cool stuff. I was curious in your SThread example, your SThread Callgate, how you protect from just confused deputy kinds of problems. Like Callgate wants to take like the session key setup wants to take a pointer parameter for some reason. How you make sure that the caller can't guess where the private key is in the callee's context, and guess and cause it to use the private key, when it was supposed to be using this random pointer parameter.
So it's a great question. So I think what you're to summarize your question, I think what you're asking is, what if you need to share data by pointer that's sensitive between compartments?
Well, even the data that the pointer is supposed to point to isn't sensitive, but
Yeah.
I can kind of guess it to point to something that is sensitive because it's in the receiver, the callee, right?
So let me see. The way that we've done the partitioning is such that there is literally no sensitive data in the address space of the low privilege compartment.
But it will be in the address space of the privileged compartment.
Correct.
Once you get into that, right?
Yes. And so you're saying, but so then once you're in the privileged compartment, we've audited the code for the privileged compartment.
But can the privileged code use a pointer provided?
Now I understand what you're saying. Now I understand what you're saying. Sorry,
Just
please.
happen to point to the private key in the privileged container.
That's a great question. So for the designs I've shown you, we were careful to do sort of RPC-like copies of things to prevent that kind of thing. For the crypto key material that we're looking at, these objects are small, and so that hasn't been a problem. I think my higher level answer is that in your partitioning, you would hope that the application would have the property that you would try to not pass things that are big across those boundaries and use copies like system calls for that kind of thing. Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Have you looked at the what was mentioned before, trusted SGX?
Oh yeah.
Trusted zone.
Yeah. So we haven't done it yet, but we think that secure enclaves might be a really good fit for Callgates. I think what's interesting is I've already seen one paper sort of proposing, they don't use our terminology, but proposing something like that. And this was in Oakland, and it was riddled with Oracle attacks, by the way. Because what they said, is look, the key's inside the enclave. Yeah, been there. That's not enough. Like if you can invoke the enclave from low privilege code, right. So I think the point is, like, what should the right interfaces be between the enclave and the unprivileged code? I think that's a very interesting research question, one I hope to work on.
This is where your small secured code is an advantage if it goes into the secured plane.
Wait, I almost phrase it in the reverse, which is that the enclaves have to be pretty small in the current implementation. So thank God the code is small, right?
Is there a natural way of combining the two approaches and having the best of both worlds?
Yeah, I mean, so, yeah. One thing that I didn't get into is why do I think information flow control, which I scrupulously avoided using as a phrase in my talk, is the right answer in the browser, whereas I use discretionary access control on the server. And one answer is that in a high-level language like JavaScript, and for the web where principles are origins, I think that information flow control makes a lot of sense because it's easy to reason about labels, because everybody already knows about origins in the same origin policy. And if you look at systems like HiStar, there are lots of labels floating around, and you have to come up with what the right labels are, and there's no easy way to do that sometimes. So my intuition is that you could combine Wedge on the server side, and so maybe this isn't the decomposition you meant, but what I mapped it to, which makes sense to me, is that you would use Cowl on the browser, but something like Wedge on the server. Because I think as an OS primitive, the OS is somewhat more low level than JavaScript, and DAC makes more sense to me there rather than diffc. But
So I was asking, for instance, on the browser.
both discretionary and mandatory,
Yeah.
we do both, actually. I didn't get into that. And the reason is, okay, great question. Where is it? So we actually enforce DAC alongside Mac in the browser. And the reason is we don't want to give users nasty surprises. Like if there were a covert channel in the untrusted code, we wouldn't just want to turn off DAC by default. But in our system, there could be a conflict between the policy that Mac has and the policy that DAC has. DAC could be more restrictive. So what we say for now is the user is king. If you want mint.com to work in your browser, you can pop up a dialog and say, I disable DAC here because I want to allow Mint to be able to read my bank statement. But the browser does confinement. So if the user's worried about covert channels, maybe they would say no at that point. But of course, the user may not understand this kind of thing. That's a problem. Maybe I'll take one last one. I know we're short on time. Yeah.
It's a short question. So your DAC was very reminiscent of microkernels.
Yeah.
With like L4 with the capability system. Have you considered if there would be some kind of advantage to implementing it on a microkernel where you could reuse some of the capability systems?
You know, my intuition is that we stopped short of capabilities, and because our DAC system is definitely not a capability system. I think capabilities are harder to use than the kind of primitives that I was talking about today, and so that's my personal belief. So I think that's my answer, really. I mean, I think we felt like our primitives were hard enough to use. We were trying to keep it simple, and we shied away from something as complicated as capabilities.